Hello, everybody, and good evening. I think we'll make a start. You're all very welcome. And can I say how lovely it is to see people in person after almost 2 years of online and so on. So listen, you're very welcome here tonight to, this is the third event that we're hosting in relation to the big climate conference over in Glasgow, COP26. So we're doing at least one event a day here at Queen's, so please fill your boots in terms of coming along to these events. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to look at a local approach to the global problem of the planetary crisis. And by the planetary crisis, I mean the conjoined crises of the climate, which tends to dominate our discussion and thinking, but also the ecological crisis. We are experiencing the sixth great mass extinction event on the planet. But we also need to remember, in the context of why we're all socially distanced, masks and so on, is that the pandemic itself is not an extra crisis on top of these two other crises, but an intrinsic part of it. You know, the whole, I think, misunderstanding of that the pandemic and the releasing of the virus in China is in part to do with the ways in which human beings are now encroaching on wilderness areas, enabling viruses to escape that have been essentially locked up in these wilderness areas. So for me, those ecological, physical crises also need to be set against the fact that we're also undergoing social and political crises. We've got the rise of fascism, xenophobia, an increasingly unequal society. Again, to go back to the pandemic has revealed that it's only when the tide goes out you know who's naked. It's revealed a lot of structural inequalities in our society. You know, my brother is a busman in Dublin, and it was very quickly apparent in the early part of the crisis that what society needs as a key worker is not a well-paid, very eloquent, slightly pot-bellied now professor who could safely work at home, but actually somebody like my brother, or a farmer, or a key worker in retail, or in the hospitals. So that's the core economy, and it did annoy me, as perhaps some of you else of you in the audience, the debate in the media, particularly from business interests, was the economy is being closed down. Well, that's one way of looking at it, or actually what's happened is the core economy that we need to meet our basic needs has been revealed. And what it revealed was not very nice, to say the least. Precarious, low-paid, often non-unionised labour, often very gendered, often with disproportionate amounts of communities of colour, represented in these key industries. So there you have two elements, very broad brush. We have the planetary crisis, of which the pandemic is an intrinsic part of it. And then going alongside that, we have social, ecological and environmental issues that often are insufficiently connected to the social and economic questions of our age. And that's what community wealth building, in a way, is partly set up, or you could say it can be repurposed to address all of those crises. Nobody here tonight on the panel, and I'll introduce them in a moment, or indeed people who in the audience who know community wealth building that's been pioneered by Preston, the Wirral, North Ayrshire, and Cleveland. There's even a pilot that's going to be happening, we hope, and Sean here will tell us maybe from the Department for Communities. Nobody's saying it's a panacea, but our political and economic system is broke. It isn't working for everybody. And community wealth building at least stands as an interesting, localized experiment in terms of democratizing the local economy, public sector institutions in particular using their power to collaborate. And indeed, even, I won't show you the slide because I don't want to walk around too much, is that even Queens University is now accepted in its corporate plan to be an anchor institution. And that's a term, for those of you not familiar with community wealth building, is essential to the understanding of what are the institutions we need. Anchor institution simply means an institution that isn't going to move anywhere. Often the problem with corporations in particular, they come into a community or a society and they stay for a few years and then they go because they're footloose. They're not connected in a way. They go wherever they get the biggest return for their buck, for example. Whereas anchor institutions like universities, like hospitals, like schools, like our rescue services, like our local councils, they ain't going anywhere. Now, for some people, that's a very sad thing because you say, well, they're crap and so on. That's a whole other issue. But the point is, they are locally embedded and therefore often have the power to create in a local context a different economic model. And essentially that's the broad brush, and I'm going to go into more detail of what community wealth building is. So I'd like to welcome on behalf of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action that I co-direct, Queens University, the Northern Ireland Festival of Social Science, Development Trusts Northern Ireland, Belfast Trademark and the Department for Communities. Whew. There's a lot there. They're all hosting this. They're all interested in this issue. And just to finish, before I introduce Mary and Sean, we do have a third speaker, Sean Mccabe, who has been delayed and he's currently rushing up the M1 to be here on time. Otherwise, I will fill in and you'll have more of me talking at you if Sean doesn't turn up. Is that what excites me about community wealth building is that it gives tangible expression to often abstract phrases that many of us have heard. Building back better, just transition, Green New Deal, and so on. Often these don't really land with people outside political activists, the policy circle, academics. Whereas there's something about community wealth building, when you see it in operation, it actually is working. It's empirical, you can feel it, you can taste it, you can touch it. Whereas often these other concepts, well-meaning, and I absolutely am a supporter of them all. In fact, I'm wearing a T-shirt here that says there's no jobs on a dead planet, which I think is true. I think it's logically the case. But community wealth building has a purchase because it's an actually existing example of a different way of organising resources. I mean, I teach economics. Oh, it's very, very difficult. It is, but if you've ever managed a budget, you can understand economics. In the sense, the way in which the media portrays economics is this incredibly complex issue, and often in a very patronising way that many women in the audience would be familiar with, where it's almost like a man telling you, oh, it's very complicated, dear. And it's amazing how people cede and give away their sense of what economics is because they think that it's somehow beyond their comprehension. It's actually very simple. How do we mobilise as a society, as human beings with needs, with desires? How do we organise our resources, our land, labour, capital, our ingenuity, our science and technology? How do we mobilise these in a way that meets our needs, fulfills our wants, make sure nobody goes to bed hungry, and so on? That's what economics is, whereas it's presented in this very abstract, mathematicized, statisticized manner. It's almost like the way the Catholic Church used Latin for centuries to bamboozle people. So if nothing else, I find community wealth building is a great way of educating people into what economics is. It's kind of a barefoot, grassroots form of understanding the economy. So it has an educative function as well as a practical function in terms of meeting people's needs at a local level. I think it does connect with those issues that are going on across the water with COP. Community wealth building is at the grassroots level, whereas what's happening over in COP is the high level of the international political elite. Yes, we do have activists outside the conference centre and so on. I think that's where community wealth building lies. That sense of grassroots innovation, of people trying to figure out how, in the context of the fact that we're now 1 degree warmer, we're about 1.1 degree, we have to try and keep global average heating below 1.5. On current trajectory, we're on for a 2.7 degree world. And some of you may say, oh, that wouldn't be bad. Top up my tan, a couple of extra degrees, maybe some wine in Cullibaccy, sounds great. But think about it. Or for those of us who've lived in this part of the world, what 1.1 degree heating has given the island of Ireland, and indeed the other island, is in July this year, Ireland, for goodness sake, issued its very first amber heat warning. Ireland. Quickly followed then by localised flooding in parts of Belfast, and that's the pattern that's going to continue. According to the climate prediction models for this part of the world, it's going to be flooding and these heat waves that we're not used to. You know that bit in the film Jaws where a man sees the shark and he says to the other guy, we're going to need a bigger boat. Well, what we're going to need is bigger drains. Our infrastructure that's set up to deal with, the rain cannot deal with these kind of monsoon-type deluges. We have built too much with concrete that acts as a conduit to bring these flooding. We're going to have to invest in nature-based solutions, more green and blue spaces, and so on. So part of what excites me again about not just the whole issue of the green transition is to demonstrate the multiple co-benefits of climate action. Because often it's presented as a negative issue. You know, often Greens, and I'm a proud member of that movement, although it's a complicated story, don't mention the Green Party down south. This is being recorded. How are you aiming? Is that the Green movement is seen as like the teetotaler at the party. It's all this kind of sacrificial denial of what we need. You know, you can't fly, you can't have red meat. And there's this kind of austerity associated with green politics, which I think has set up the wrong frame of understanding that what's on offer is a politics and a political economy of abundance. But it's an abundance in a different way, which is where I think community wealth building comes in. It's about more libraries, more sharing of goods and services, not necessarily about people individually consuming things like Gollum, my precious. You know, our society has encouraged us to essentially have a view of the good life of whoever dies with the most shit wins. I'm not saying community wealth building is motivated to challenge that, but it's in that broad context that we need a paradigm shift, a new industrial revolution, a new enlightenment almost that we had in Europe a couple of hundred years ago. That's the scale of the challenge, but I think it's replete with opportunities. In making this transition, our urban areas can be cleaner. You know, we had an experience, a little taste of that during the pandemic when air quality massively improved across most European cities. We had fish life returning to Venice. Nature is quite resilient if we give it a chance. It just needs a breather. And that's also part of where community wealth building comes in. How can it initiate at the local level tangible ways of reorganizing our economy, our productive capacities that meet our needs, that don't wreck the planet? And to me, I don't know if there is any community wealth building events happening in Glasgow. Well, this is our message from here in Belfast to Glasgow. These are the types of initiatives that we need to start circulating more generally. There are experiments. Nobody's saying that this is a solution to all our problems, but we do need to move beyond business as usual. And if Edwin is listening, please move beyond green growth. It's almost like we're trapped in a holding pattern of how we're conducting policy in the same old way. At the very least, community wealth building is a localized, innovative, disruptive experiment in trying to figure out a different way of living, meeting our needs within the planet's limits. So we're going to have three speakers. As I say, I hope our third speaker turns up, not least for your sake. We're going to start with Mary McManus, who's an independent researcher and a community wealth building advocate. And Mary's going to give a kind of an overview in a much more pictorially pleasant way than I've done of what community wealth building is. Then we'll have Sean Byers, who's a researcher with Trademark Belfast, a political and education organisation affiliated with the trade union movement. And then we're going to have, hopefully, Sean Mccabe, and he is the executive director of the Climate Justice Centre of the TASK organisation. That stands for the Task Force for Action on Social Change. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mary and get your slides up. So you're all very welcome. And after they've spoken, there will be opportunity for Q&A and discussion.
Oh, where's the way to do that? Is it working? Yeah. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. My background is actually in social justice, and I spent over 20 years working in the advice sector, most of which was in the Frontline Advice Centre in Inner East Belfast. I became interested in community wealth building as a systemic approach to targeting poverty and inequality after I became aware of the outcomes being achieved by Preston City Council. And as part of a master's here at Queens in 2020, I did some research into why Belfast had not adopted community wealth building, comparing Belfast's inclusive growth strategy with Preston and North Ayrshire's community wealth building strategies. So tonight I'm going to share with you a summary of some recent research that I did last summer, which looked at how community wealth building, place-based climate action and donut economics intersect and relate to each other for a joint project between Queens and University of Central Lancashire. So I'm going to start tonight by giving a short definition of place-based climate action network and the donut economics approach before focusing on community wealth building and examples of places where all three approaches are coming together to address social, economic and environmental justice. So this was my guiding principle when doing the research. Because key to dealing with all of these issues is action at a local level. So an ounce of practice is generally worth a ton of theory. So to begin, the Place-Based Climate Action Network is a 5-year project that was set up in 2019 with funding from the Economic and Social Research Council. It's made up of 3 climate commissions and 2 theme-based platforms on finance and adaptation. Climate commissions are designed to deal with the implementation gap between international and national policy and local place-based climate action. The network aims to be innovative through ambitious climate change governance arrangements at a local level. Climate commissions are independent bodies made up of the research community and decision makers from the public, private and third sectors, all collaborating together to translate climate justice into place-based action at a local level. They're designed to facilitate two-way multi-level engagement between researchers and stakeholders. At the time of doing this research in August, there were 3 core city climate commissions: Leeds, Belfast and Edinburgh. 6 other places representing both cities and places have joined the network independently. And the network also, the project also provides a small grants fund of 400,000 for climate change researchers and research users. So with regard to action, I find that so far local climate commissions have been more about setting up governance structures and doing research to support action rather than tangible local climate action. So moving on to donut economics. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is a concept by Kate Raworth. And according to the economist Kate Raworth, the challenge for humanity in the 21st century is: how do we meet the needs of all within the needs of the planet? For Raworth, the endless pursuit of economic growth is the reason for the current extraordinary levels of inequality and the climate crisis. And is actually, economic growth is something for the last century. Rather than growth, our goal for the 21st century should be to thrive. She created the concept of the donut in 2012. The inner ring represents the social foundation floor, below which no one should fall. The outer ring represents the ecological ceiling beyond which we should not overshoot without causing severe and irreversible damage to the Earth's system function. The donut represents the safe and just space for humanity, the sweet spot between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. In order to get into the sweet spot, we must design economies to be regenerative and distributive. The donut offers a systems thinking way to view an economy where it is embedded within and dependent upon society and the living world. The donut's a really useful visualization that brings together environmental sustainability and social justice. It was originally designed to be used at a global level. However, numerous cities are now working with the Donut Economics Action Lab and experimenting with using it as a compass to measure socio-economic and environmental progress. So with regard to action, I found that apart from Amsterdam, where the donut has been integrated into the city's circular economy strategy, and in Newham, where it has been incorporated into their community wealth building agenda, I found that it's been used to draw up city portraits and set metrics, but it has yet to be translated into actual action. So moving on to community wealth building. So while community wealth building emerged as a desire to solve socioeconomic issues such as poverty and inequality, more and more it now embodies environmental goals. The Centre for Local Economic Strategies define community wealth building as a new people-centred approach to local economic development, which redirects wealth back into the local economy and places control and benefits into the hands of local people. Traditional economic approaches rely on wealth trickling down. Community wealth building wires the distribution of wealth in from the outset. Like donut economics, and like John was talking about, it's not about trying to tweak or improve our current system. It's a new paradigm. It's about transforming it. So a simple way to understand community wealth building is to think about the economy as a leaky bucket. The New Economics Foundation simply called the approach plugging the leaks. Money flows into the bucket and leaks are plugged to stop money leaving, ensuring it has a beneficial multiplier effect as it is spent and respent in an area. So practically, community wealth building has 5 pillars. And as John said, central to the approach is the anchor institution, which are the large public or not-for-profit organisations such as the local authorities, health trusts or universities like here, such as Queens. They employ large numbers of people and have significant purchasing power. And they're called anchors because, as John said, they're not footloose. They're rooted in, it's not footloose capital, they're rooted in a particular place. So the first pillar of community wealth building is fair employment and just labour markets. Anchor institutions have a defining impact on the prospects of local people. Anchors having targeted recruitment programmes for lower income areas, anchors paying the real living wage and building progression routes all improve local economies. Out of 8,000 odd businesses and organisations that are accredited with the Real Living Wage Foundation, only one public sector organisation in Northern Ireland is accredited. There's only 38 in total accredited in Northern Ireland. That's not to say that all the anchors don't pay the real living wage, but it's just telling that there's only one here. So the second pillar is progressive procurement of goods and services. This is where local anchor institutions collaborate to ensure that their procurement supports the local economy. This means breaking down big contracts to ensure that local small, medium enterprises and cooperatives are in a position to bid for contracts. It involves introducing social clauses into tenders and having meet the buyer events to support local businesses to tender for contracts. This all contributes to developing dense local supply chains for businesses likely to support local employment and retain wealth locally. The third pillar is plural ownership of the economy. This is about developing and growing small enterprises, community organisations, cooperatives and municipal ownership. Ownership models like these keep the wealth in a place and are more financially generative for the local economy. The fourth pillar is socially just use of land and property. Anchor institutions own a significant amount of land and assets. Take Belfast, for example. 40% of the land is owned by anchor institutions, with Belfast City Council and the Harbour Commission owning 34% between them. In the community wealth building model, these assets are treated as part of our commonwealth and their functioning and ownership provides a social and financial benefit for citizens rather than for private interests. And the fifth and final pillar is making financial power work for local places. This is about increasing flows of investment within local economies by harnessing and recirculating the wealth that exists as opposed to attracting capital. This includes redirecting local authority pension funds to local projects and supporting mutually owned banks and credit unions. So that's the 3 concepts. So in order to deal with the twin and interrelated problems of inequality and the climate crisis, we need a holistic, place-based approach that combines the social, economic and environmental. Given the latest IPCC report, the latest IPCC report has declared a code red for humanity, it is imperative that action is taken now. Despite what needs to be done, research shows that local councils do not know how to incorporate this work into their delivery plans. There is an implementation gap. I find that community wealth building is the how. It offers here is one I made earlier, blueprint to bridge the implementation gap to deliver on local climate action. It offers an already tried and tested how to achieve better socio-economic outcomes, and with more and more places now integrating climate action into community wealth building, it's an approach that can give local officials the confidence to implement local climate action. Community wealth building is so fundamentally about doing that Preston City Council only published its first community wealth building strategy in 2021, despite having applied the practice since 2012. With its emphasis on fair employment and democratic ownership, community wealth building is ideally placed to deliver a just transition. Research has also shown that a social mandate where reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are aligned with individual concerns such as personal and family health, family security and social cohesion is more likely to motivate behaviour and policy change. Preston, North Ayrshire and Newham have all adopted community wealth building as their approach to economic development, dealing with the climate emergency and as their strategy for recovery from COVID-19. And I selected these three places as the case studies where this is all coming together because these three places have a really strong record of taking action, not just creating strategies or, talking about it. They actually do what they say they're going to do. So to talk to the first one being Preston, because it's the oldest, and it's the one that has, because it is the oldest, it has the one that has the most outcomes. Community wealth building has been dubbed the Preston model due to the city's pioneering application of the approach. They began in 2012 by becoming a real living wage employer and began work with other anchor institutions in the city to establish where their procurement spend was flowing. Discovering that 458 million was leaving the Preston and wider Lancashire economy, they formed a procurement practitioners group to relocalise their spending. In 2017, they had relocalised 274 million, which resulted in Preston moving out of the top 20% most deprived cities in the UK, the creation of 4,000 real living wage jobs and a reduction in unemployment from 6.5% in 2014 to 3.1% in 2017. Since 2017, they've been developing worker-owned cooperatives, a mutual bank with the Wirral and Liverpool City Council, and have invested £100 million of council employee pension funds in student housing, and they're now developing a municipally owned cinema and leisure complex. In 2018, Preston was named the most rapidly improving city in the Good Growth for Cities Index by Demos and PricewaterhouseCoopers. In 2021, using this same index, Preston was named the best city to live and work in the northwest of England. Community wealth building has also made Preston more resilient to economic shocks, as in December 2020, Preston had a furlough rate of 6.9%, while the national average was 12.5%. Kate Rayworth regularly cites Preston as an example of the donut in action. So this year, Preston launched their new strategy, Community Wealth Building 2.0, Leading Resilience and Recovery in Preston. It's a comprehensive plan that brings all sectors together to work on achieving social, economic and environmental justice. Some of the proposed actions and aspirations which clearly demonstrate local climate action, donut economics and community wealth building coming together in the new strategy include working closely with other anchors, a plan to work closely with other anchors and community partners to reimagine and deliver a vision for the city where active travel, public and green spaces, clean energy and affordable housing replace cars, shops and office blocks. Using decarbonisation to create further opportunities for cooperative development and community municipal energy. The Council will use its influence with other councils across Lancashire to promote a strategy of regional investment which includes directing a share of the Lancashire pension scheme into renewable and clean energy investments. They're going to explore the potential of community municipal bonds and community shares to mobilise local savings to invest in projects which deliver community benefits, support local recovery from the pandemic and invest in social and climate resilience. They're also exploring opportunities for public and private investment in district heating in Preston. And they're prioritising opportunities for managing council parks, woodland to increase carbon capture and improve the local environment. So to move on now to the second case study, which is North Ayrshire. In May, with these two examples that are coming up as well, it's like not only is their track record great, but it's also been during COVID. So they haven't slowed down. And in fact, it seems to have given them more impetus with their community wealth building agendas. So North Ayrshire launched their community wealth building strategy live on Facebook in 2020, making it clear that they wanted to move beyond growth-based economics to ensure a social foundation for their citizens. The Council want to create a more regenerative economy that is not based on extraction, but on production that works for both people and planet, with action planned across the 5 pillars of community wealth building. Since the Community Wealth Building Strategy was launched, the Council published their Economic Recovery and Renewal Strategy, a local new Green Deal, in September 2020, which focuses on using community wealth building principles to build back the local economy better, fairer and greener post-pandemic. An £8.8 million investment fund will be used as a key element of a Green New Deal by maximising energy regeneration using the Council's land and assets. And they've already taken action on this, with the tender specification being released in July 2021 for a council-owned solar farm that will help curb fuel poverty, help the council to become one of the first councils to achieve net zero by 2030, and they believe the farm will produce 34% of its energy needs while producing a surplus of approximately 13 million that can be invested in the region. They also launched a £500,000 Green Jobs Fund to ensure a just transition for North Ayrshire. They're investing in commercial estates, including improving sustainability. They're tackling vacant and derelict land and buildings in their town centres. And they're supporting economic development, including through community regeneration and ownership. The Council also plan to use their capital investment to accelerate reform of the economy and the wider regeneration of the area, at the same time as tackling climate change, with all capital projects such as the construction of social housing and a flood protection scheme employing community wealth building principles. They have also launched an anchor network with East and South Ayrshire councils and all the other anchors that are listed there. Each organisation has signed up to an anchor charter which commits them to individual and collaborative action across the 5 pillars, plus a 6th climate change pillar. And in order to track their community wealth building and their inclusive and green economic recovery progress, the Council have developed an inclusive economy dashboard using the donut. So the third and final case study I wanted to share with you is Newham. In January 2020, the London Borough of Newham launched their community wealth building strategy with the stated focus of the pursuit of economic, social and environmental justice, so that long-term prosperity, well-being and fairness for all our residents in the borough is achieved, and our response to the climate emergency is progressed. Newham are progressing their strategy, having achieved accreditation as a London living wage employer in March 2021, which also means that any supplier who wants to work with the Council must pay the real living wage too. In July 2021, the Council launched its Towards a Better Newham COVID-19 recovery strategy, declaring itself the first London borough to use livelihood, well-being and happiness as its prime measure of economic success. The strategy has 8 pillars, which demonstrates how the Council is looking to ensure that none of its residents fall below the social foundations while working within planetary boundaries. So this is, in 2020, Newham published its Climate Emergency Action Plan as part of the Newham Climate Now campaign, and committed to reporting on action taken every year on global warming, poor air quality and waste. They set up an independent citizens' assembly on climate change in 2020 with 36 independently and randomly selected local residents. They have since convened a youth climate assembly and are trialling a standing citizens' assembly for a year to inform the Climate Emergency Action Plan. Citizens select their own topics and have chosen to focus on greening the borough and the 15-minute borough. So this is some more reports from Newham. This is We Are Action, We Are Newham. This is the Council's annual report on their Climate Emergency Action Plan. It details achievements so far, as well as outlining future action they will take. One of the examples cited in this report that demonstrates how this Council is applying all these three concepts to their work is with regard to care workers. They said that we've been looking at innovative ways of reducing carbon in all aspects of the work we do. For example, we examined how we work with our care workers, including how we can better support them, which has included paying them the real living wage. We went beyond this to shift to a patch-based care approach, linking workers to specific areas. This enables care workers to be more embedded in their local community. It also reduces travel distance and time, promoting more walking and cycling, with the knock-on effect of reducing carbon emissions and improving air quality. So, to conclude, the three concepts and approaches can all contribute to achieving social, economic and environmental justice, as is being demonstrated by Preston, North Ayrshire and Newham. Place-based climate action network and the donut framework can supply the data to provide evidence of where we are and where we need to get to. The donut can provide the framework that combines the social and environmental goals that need to be measured. And community wealth building, really importantly, offers the how to achieve these goals. So, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mary. And I'm so happy that our third speaker, Sean Mccabe from the Task Force for Action on Climate Change and their Climate Justice Centre has arrived. You're very welcome, Sean. So I think that gives us a good overview of, real life examples. These are happening, right here, right now, across the water. Let's hope that we're going to get something here in Ireland, either north or south. But I couldn't help but think, and to channel the great Greta Thunberg, there's been a lot of blah, 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 not just about the climate and no action, but we've had declarations, folks, of climate and ecological emergencies by the Assembly, by the Irish Dáil, by the UK Parliament, by, at last measure, about 80% of all councils in the UK have all declared climate and ecological emergency. But what's happened? To me, again, the pandemic is what a real emergency looks like. But what Mary has shown is that rather than talk about another commission looking at poverty, a word which I think is misused, we should be talking about inequality. And we don't have a poverty problem, folks, we have a wealth problem. But we never really hear this in our media. So we have these, well-meaning commissions and discussions about dealing with poverty and inequality, the same with climate action, and nothing happens. At least what we have here are examples, flawed and so on as they are perhaps, but they're actually attempts to try and build something differently, give tangible expression, if you like, to an aspiration for something better than what we have at the moment, because at the moment isn't working. It isn't working in terms of, it isn't meeting the needs of our people. Just to take one issue that people misunderstand or they don't sufficiently are cognizant of. We have this obsession with economic growth, and we see North Ayrshire in particular moving beyond that, looking at a dashboard of metrics. Economic growth in a society could increase by, pick your number, 10, 15%. If all of that wealth created goes to one person, it's still economic growth. If there's no jobs created as a result of that growth, it's still economic growth. And it's a major issue that most of us really need to start understanding more as citizens. The same way I mentioned how most of us feel bamboozled by economics because it's seen as very technical. Economics, folks, is a form of politics. There is no objective way of understanding the economy. The economics is not a science like physics or maths. It has its origins actually in Adam Smith, his town in Glasgow, where the COP conference is happening. It's in political economy. That's what we're arguing here, different forms of political economy, which are about our judgments as citizens of fairness, of inclusion, of how equal or not we want their societies. There's nothing immutable or given as a scientific economic fact that our societies have to be organised the way they are. And the way they're organised today is a word that hasn't really been mentioned yet. It's called capitalism. When was the last time you heard that being mentioned in the mainstream media? I just mean that in a descriptive sense. The system we live in now is called capitalism. But it goes by the name of the economy. And we have economists talking about the economy, which are talking about a capitalist economy. And there is, I think, a laudable attempt within the Community Wealth Building Initiative to educate citizens and so on about the nature of this system. You could still be pro-capitalist even after engaging with this. Hopefully you're not, and you begin to see that actually you can organise society in a different way, so that on a night like this, and sadly I think many people in the room probably know of people and maybe have experienced this themselves, on a cold night like this, because Northern Ireland has some of the highest rates of fuel poverty in Western Europe. If you look on the Department for Communities website and you Google fuel poverty, it'll say 42%. 42% of households are going to be facing the choice tonight on a cold November evening: do I heat or do I eat? I don't think that's good enough in terms of, again, connecting this issue of poverty and inequality in society that Mary talked about in terms of the discussions that's happening in these other places across the water. That is a climate change story, folks. Because people often are in very badly insulated houses. They're heating the street. I have colleagues in planning and architecture who showed me, thermal maps of streets. And you see all this red around people's windows and even coming out of walls because they're so badly insulated. People are living already in straitened conditions, and they're spending more than 10% of their income just to stay warm. That's the definition of fuel poverty. That is a climate change good news story in the sense we need people, there's jobs there to retrofit our houses. What about a community wealth building approach to deal with, in my view, the abomination of fuel poverty in a wealthy society such as ours, where people are going to be facing that awful choice between heat or eat? And in a way, that's what's exciting about this, about seeing where the needs are, where the resources need to go. As I say, you can meet multiple benefits. We reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because people are, even if they're still using oil or coal or gas, they're using less of it to stay warm. It creates jobs. And the reality is that when people are in thermally efficient houses, because often it's people on low income people spend their money, which is absolutely what we need to keep the economic resilience, as Mary talked about, to stop that leaky bucket. It's only rich and affluent people who take money out of the economy, often offshore, through the use of all sorts of tax avoidance and evadance issues. So anyway, sorry, I'm off a bit of rant there. Thanks, Greta, channeling my inner Greta. So our next speaker is Sean Byers from Trademark Belfast. Sean, the floor is yours.
Cheers, John. I'll just stand here if it's all right. Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction and for cutting about 5 minutes out of what I had prepared for your retrofit spiel. So for those of you who don't know me, I work for Trademark. Trademark was initially established by the trade union movement to deal with issues of sectarianism in the workplace and communities, and that was the organisation's bread and butter for a long time, and we still do that on a sort of case-by-case basis, and thankfully it's not as common as it used to be, but it still happens. After the financial crash in 2008, we sort of found ourselves moving into the space of political education, mainly because no one else was doing it on the island. We looked at the trade union movement, we looked at different organisations, and they weren't doing political education around how the system under which we live works and how it affects us, who it benefits and how. So we moved into that space, and we still do that, and that's a core part of our work now. And really as a result of that, we started looking at alternative ways of organising the economy, and we moved into cooperative development. And we've been doing that for 10 years. Ali, sitting up there, is our resident co-op expert, and Ali spends a lot of her time travelling around Ireland, setting up cooperatives, as well as Britain, including the North's most successful worker-owned cooperative, the Belfast Clean Society. And we still do that on an ad hoc basis with no institutional support. So as a result of that work, we sort of segued into community wealth building when it began to gain traction and we became aware of it. We saw it as a framework into which we could situate some of that co-op development work and to really try to scale it up. At the same time, DT&I and Charlie Fisher were looking at what could be done to advance community wealth building here. So we partnered with Charlie and his organisation to try to explore and advance the concept, and that's, as John has alluded to, that's what we're doing at the moment. With the support of the Department for Communities, we're engaging with community organisations, and and communities to explore what's already being done that might align with the community wealth building agenda, what communities think needs to happen to better support a community wealth building agenda, and how that can inform what the Department for Communities is doing, and then hopefully the executive as a whole. So for us, I suppose, Trademark, the starting point for us really looking at community wealth building is understanding no one's coming to save us, right? So the Tories aren't coming to save us, certainly, and increasingly it seems like the Labour Party isn't coming to save us, right? So community wealth building in large part is about taking control of our own economic destinies. It's about doing what we can, where we can, with the resources we have to build a green and just economy. So I'm going to try to keep my comments brief, and I'm sure John will keep me to that, and focus on just a few areas where community wealth building and climate action aligns in the North. So I'm going to start with procurement. As Mary's outlined, progressive procurement is one of the key pillars of community wealth building. We've seen in the last year how globalised, interconnected supply chains are extremely vulnerable to different types of shocks. The COVID-related shocks, climate-related shocks, economic shocks, and these aren't temporary problems. These aren't problems that are going to go away. They're going to be with us for a long time. So it's clear that there's a need and there's an opportunity to develop more resilient, localised, and sustainable supply chains. And beginning with the public sector's procurement strategy, these supply chains can be developed in a way that massively reduces carbon emissions. And that's especially important when you consider that 90% of organisations, up to 90% of organisations' total emissions come from Scope 3 emissions, value chain emissions, right? So if public anchors in particular, if they were to adopt a green progressive procurement strategy, they have an opportunity to reduce those carbon emissions. And I'd say that, you know, they have an obligation to do so. They have an obligation to track these emissions and reduce them to the best of their ability. But this progressive green procurement strategy also, as Mary said, creates opportunities for co-ops, for social enterprises, for community businesses, and that's, you know, that fits with the community wealth building agenda. But these businesses need to be supported. You know, they need to be fostered and developed. It's a big bugbear of ours that support for cooperative development, official state, institutional, financial support for cooperative development in the North is virtually non-existent. They spend more on biscuits in the institutions than they do in supporting cooperatives. And that's what's needed, because often these businesses are the more resilient in the long term, they're more democratic, they deliver more equal outcomes, but they need support in that first initial phase to get their feet on the ground. So in this regard, I suppose we're seeing some movement in the right direction. Conor Murphy's announced a Social Value Act. Local council level, we're seeing the adoption of social value frameworks, which give consideration to environmental objectives. But certainly from our perspective, they could be strengthened, and they need to be strengthened. Environmental provisions are still a minor factor when it comes to these. How and who the contracts are awarded to is still an issue. One of the most important supply chains, I suppose, is food production and distribution. Agriculture in the North is dominated by livestock farming for export and processing. And this accounts for nearly 30% of emissions. But these sectors also account for 70,000 jobs in farming and agri-foods. They provide the equivalent of 70,000 full-time jobs. So that means decarbonisation of these sectors will be difficult, it'll be challenging. But John here, and I'm sure he's going to talk about it, he's shown that it can be transformative if the right supports are put in place to ensure a just transition and a sustainable future for farming communities. In the north here, thanks to Brexit, we are currently transitioning away from the Common Agricultural Policy, one of the single most environmentally destructive policies ever conceived. And it's one that increases inequality amongst farmers too. It rewards land grabs, deforestation, it destroys the livelihoods of African farmers and so on. So transitioning away from CAP also presents an opportunity for us, an opportunity to promote more sustainable, regenerative farming practices, to build localized food production and distribution networks, like for example, community supported agriculture. Community supported agriculture has shorter supply chains, it reduces transport emissions, it increases biodiversity, and it comes with all these benefits: environmental benefits, economic benefits, creates employment, provides a local market for farmers, and almost all of the farming pound stays within the local community, in line with the community wealth building agenda. So a transition away from CAP should mean more incentives for farmers, for small farmers in particular, to adopt some of these environmentally sustainable practices that also support community wealth building. Now, the climate bill is coming down the line, hopefully the more progressive one we see, would be a game changer for agriculture. It's going to force the agricultural sector's hand. So those supports need to be put in place. And there's a lot that local authorities that can be doing to advance this sort of agenda. One of the main barriers is startup finance for community supported agriculture. Local authorities can also protect, and this is another barrier, protect and allocate the land for food growing. They can commit through their procurement strategies to sourcing locally produced food. And that's on top of their own tree planting, reforestation sort of projects. And I'm sure, as I said, Sean's going to speak about this at more length. And Sean's work on this is really like groundbreaking, actually, in the island of Ireland. John has talked about retrofitting and green housing. That's another obvious area where community wealth building could come together with climate action. Residential heating is responsible for 15% of all emissions in the north, and that figure's much higher in Belfast. As John has said, fuel poverty rates in the north are amongst the highest in Europe, and are set to increase with the price hikes we're seeing coming down the line. So John's done, along with his colleagues under the PCAM project, has done some brilliant research on this to show that a mass retrofit program for the north just is a no-brainer. It will reduce emissions, help combat food poverty, increase or improve health outcomes, and generate employment. The Housing Executive, for its part, has estimated that to retrofit 600,000 and public and private homes to Band B would cost about 9 billion, but it would save households £700 a year. That's 9 billion of investment in the local economy. It's 9 billion of investment in local green jobs. Potentially over 3,000 full-time jobs here in the north. And that should be used to sustain good, well-paid, unionised jobs with the Housing Executive directly, and to create employment with specialist SMEs, co-ops, and community businesses that are purposely developed and fostered to meet that emerging need. And fortunately, we're able to draw on experience of places like Manchester, Nottingham, Essex, and so on, which have experimented with some of these energy efficiency projects that support community wealth building. And CLES and our organisations called Carbon Co-op are working to sort of capture the lessons from this. I'm going to very briefly turn to another area where John again has done a lot of work, and I'm riffing a lot off your work, John, here, and that's energy. So there's a growing recognition that energy will need to be brought under democratic control if we're to successfully decarbonise, provide energy security, and deliver a just transition for workers. So we're sitting at about 50% of energy generation or electricity generation from renewables, which is great. Like, it's surpassed what we aim to achieve by this point. But that'll have to be scaled up massively and very quickly if we were to get the 80% by 2030. And that's before we even talk about the electrification of heating, which has massive implications for renewable generation. Now, the climate bill and the Department for the Economies energy strategy will sort of set the strategic context for this. But the question of democratic control and ownership doesn't seem to be on anyone's minds. I've read through the draft energy strategy, and it's not even alluded to, never mind mentioned. And that's despite the fact that large parts of our energy sector are owned by international capital, including vulture funds. There's very little to no discussion at a regional, local level about the potential for municipal energy projects in the mould of those that we've seen in North Ayrshire, which is really, I would say, the model for combining community wealth building and climate action. There's no discussion about what would be required to develop them in terms of the finances of the powers. I have some ideas myself, but that's not being discussed. And again, there's next to no support for cooperative or community energy, which are common in places like Scotland, Denmark, Germany, and so on. A municipal and community energy, I think, has to play a part. Obviously, all the major strategic plan decisions have to be made by the state, and large sections of the energy sector have to come under public ownership. But municipal energy provides opportunities and benefits and can play a major role. Provides economic benefits in the form of lower tariffs and reinvested profits in the local community. And it has the added advantage of providing communities with a direct stake in a green transition. And I think that's what's needed to help bring people along. But public policy, finance, and even infrastructural development are all geared towards the growth of renewable energy in private hands, and I think that has to change. And this sort of leads me to my final comment, which is a warning, I suppose. In its most radical and ambitious form, community wealth building is about laying the foundations for a new democratic and green economy. To do this successfully, it has to be rooted in an understanding of the political economy of the wider context in which we find ourselves. Because while we're talking about community wealth building, and John sort of alluded to this, while we're talking about community wealth building and climate action over here, we're seeing orthodox, extractive models of economic development being pursued elsewhere or at the same time. And this is true at the level of the Northern Ireland Executive, where much of the focus continues to centre on GDP growth, on FDI, on global competitiveness. And it's true at a local council level, unfortunately. For example, we can see it happening in Belfast City Council, which seems to be pulling in different directions, to be diplomatic about it. So on the one hand, the council has adopted a very ambitious, radical climate action plan, and there's lots of good stuff in there. 30 actions to transition to a net zero economy. As I said, there's lots of good stuff in there, including some of the stuff I've been talking about. But this sits alongside the Belfast Agenda and the Inclusive Growth Strategy, which embrace orthodox approaches of growing the economy first and then seeing what we can do about redistributing things afterwards. And this is effectively also a pollute now, pay later sort of approach, I would suggest. And in practice, just to give you an example, this allows for policies that actually fuel wealth extraction and environmental degradation. Overdevelopment of the city centre in the form of office and retail space, overpriced apartments, hotels, student accommodation. Tribeca is just the latest example, but there's a long list of them. And if you had like a bingo card of negative social and environmental impacts, like that would be, if you would have a full house with that, like, you know. So gentrification and the exclusion of communities, property speculation and rent extraction, increased resource use and carbon emissions in the construction of these developments, increased congestion and rising pollution, a full house. And the same applies to the continued emphasis on tourism, putting all our eggs in the basket of tourism, which carries similar implications. The increased demand for air travel and increased air capacity, increased waste, the loss of public space, and the expansion of tourism-related sectors, hospitality and retail, which are not only characterised by precarious, low-paid employment, non-unionised employment by their very nature, but there's very little potential to green these sectors at all. And then with tourism, there's all those associated factors with overdevelopment that I've talked about before. So, whilst pursuing community wealth building agenda in tandem with climate action and supporting climate action, we need to keep an eye on the overarching sort of political economic framework, because without that sort of paradigm shift that John has referred to, community wealth building will only be alleviating the negative impacts of this sort of orthodox model. So that means we need to be working through the institutions with the people who are looking to promote change, but also means we need to build the capacity and power of citizens to know and critique orthodox economic agendas when they see them, to challenge institutions, and to drag them sort of kicking and screaming if needs be. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sean. I didn't realise how low was the support for cooperatives in Northern Ireland, but I don't think we can be too hard just on one section of the state. I do often wonder, we at the university promote entrepreneurship amongst our students, yet I just wonder whether or not cooperative business models and work our own business models as part of that curriculum. And I do think an important issue, which is a natural connection in a way between the community wealth building, relocalisation of the economy and climate action, is that the evidence is pretty clear, is that we are going to have to selectively deglobalize our economies, relocalize things like food and enhance food security, and particularly with energy, because part of the problem is that when you are dependent, as the island of Ireland is, on imported fossil fuels, not only is that a major cause of greenhouse gas emissions, which is causing the planetary crisis, it leaves you very energy vulnerable and insecure. In other words, it just makes economic and societal sense to have more of your food and energy in particular to be more locally sourced. So that connection there between community wealth building, which I would say is a form of selective deglobalization, would open up the space then to help us move beyond free trade, which of course is what we see going around the world, to issues like fair trade. It's not about not trading, but what do we want to trade? I mean, there's a great example in my own field of green economics of a study that was done that showed the amount of biscuits, to mention that they spend more on biscuits than cooperative ventures here in Northern Ireland, of biscuits trading between Denmark and Britain. And the conclusion of the report said it'd be easier and quicker and more carbon friendly if they just exchanged recipes. But that's the logic of our capitalist, free market, globalized system. It makes money, but it makes no ecological sense. Modern economics is ecologically irrational as well as socially destructive. Again, community wealth building is bringing those together in terms of the selective deglobalization, reducing emissions and enhancing local economic security. And I do love, if I was summarised in 2 sentences, what I took away from Sean is that we need to democratise the energy means of production. Democratise the energy means of production. And part of that is that once you change the energy system, every other part of the society has to change. Think about it. Our food, the Kilroot-produced, energy that we're now enjoying, transportation, the embedded energy in our buildings and so on, that the energy system is the foundation of society. In fact, it's the hidden, feature of most historical evolution. Every historically, known civilization, society had a particular energy source. And as we make the transition from a fossil fuel energy system to a low carbon renewable one, the issues are, is it going to be a shift from a private corporate owned fossil fuel energy system to a private corporate owned renewable energy system, which is the main agenda? Where are the opportunities for, as Sean said, democratizing and having more community based energy? So I'm delighted to welcome our last speaker, Sean Mccabe, from the Task Force for Action on Social Change and their Climate Justice Centre. So, Sean, the floor is yours.
John, is this hooked up to the internet by any chance? I've been working on issues of climate justice for about 10 years and realised a while ago that the most serious challenge we have in Ireland is obviously agriculture. Got wind of the idea of community wealth building as a concept, didn't really know much about it, but figured there must be something to it in terms of rural Ireland and addressing the agricultural challenge. And the big difference between a rural setting and an urban setting for community wealth building is, as both Mary and Sean have mentioned, anchor institutions are critical to the community wealth building model, and there's not many anchor institutions in rural parts. So how do we think about the future of our rural communities in the same way that we're thinking about the future of our urban communities? And maybe that's how I can add to this conversation today, because I think both Mary and Sean have very comprehensively addressed the opportunities and the challenges of community wealth building. And as John has said, there's massive social inequality issues that hopefully we can wrestle with through this democratization of whatever the new economy that emerges is. There's maybe as an anecdote to begin, there's a community on the island of Fintry in Scotland. I don't know if any of you have heard this story, but there was a large wind farm that was to be built beside the community, and the community said no. And so the wind farm owners, the proposed wind farm owners, came back and said, right, we'll give each of you, and they offered a pretty sizable sum of money. And the community said, well, if you can offer that, that wind farm must be worth quite a lot. If you can pay each of us off, that wind farm must be pretty valuable. What if instead of giving us that, you give us one of the wind turbines? And the company said absolutely not. And they said, well, we won't accept it here if you don't give us one of the turbines. They got one of the turbines. The company paid for the turbine, and that debt is being paid off through the earnings of the turbine. While that debt is being paid off, that community of Fintry is making about 50,000 sterling a year. When the turbine is completely paid off, the community will make roughly $500,000 a year from that one of 15 turbines outside their community. Now, if you think about some of the challenges that are beset rural communities, whether it's broadband or public transport or access to recreational facilities or anything like that, you can do a lot with $500,000 a year. If you had 2 turbines, that'd be $1 million a year. You could do even more, right? So, and it comes back to John's last point there about we are in the process of, and unfortunately we aren't, but large multinational corporations are in the process of building the assets of climate action. And who owns those assets and who benefits from those assets will have a very large bearing on, as John said, inequality. It's not a question of poverty. It's the drivers of poverty are at the top, not the bottom. And these new systems will drive how the world looks in 2030, 2040, 2050. But it's more serious than that, actually, because I firmly believe that if we don't get a handle on this and we continue to drive inequality and we don't look at issues of the just transition around the fossil fuel sector, etc., we'll destabilize our democracies. And in destabilizing our democracies, we won't make the transition at all. You know, if people perceive the future as unfair, if they can't see their own place in it, why would they work towards it? So this is about creating a shared vision for the future. So in January 2019, without much of an idea of community wealth building, and really, like honestly, despite growing up around farmers, without much of an idea how farmers perceive climate action, aside from knowing what I was told by the IFA, the Irish Agricultural Lobby, that they didn't like the idea of climate action at all. I got in a camper van and I drove around Ireland and I met with as many farmers and fishermen as I could, and other people maybe whose livelihoods were under threat. I didn't go to the Midlands where Boardmone is because ultimately you know, the unions are involved in that process, and it's a very serious process, and I didn't want to just rock up in my camper van and have a chat with people. Like that's a much more serious and much more like there's so many jobs already lost and so little done to alleviate the suffering of those who've lost the jobs, and it's a very it's a betrayal in many ways. So I was looking at maybe the next great challenge that we face, which is agriculture, which is fisheries. And what became very clear very quickly was that actually the agricultural community and the fishing community don't really have any objection to climate action as long as it's fair, you know, and that's, I think, holds across all of society. But what became even more abundant was people have more pressing challenges than climate change in their everyday life. As Rose Wall in Community Law and Mediation in Dublin says, you know, people are worried about the end of the week, not the end of the world. And if we can't grapple with that, we've got a problem in terms of how we talk about climate action. So ultimately, people don't care about climate action as much as we'd love them to. They don't. And we've actually just on Monday there released a survey that we conducted in the South with a large, 1,000 respondents with a Red Sea poll, asking them to rank their priorities. We gave them 10 challenges, including the healthcare system, housing, use of public funds, tackling crime, addressing homelessness. Climate change most frequently ranked last. And that's a reality that we have to grapple with. So the first finding, assumption that we based this work on was that actually people don't care about climate action as much as we'd want them to. And that means real leaders have to take action without public support, because the time that's left is so very small that we cannot wait for the support to build. And I think sometimes we make that mistake. All of us within even the climate movement think it's about education, it's about education. Maybe it's not. Maybe we have to shut up talking about climate change completely, and we have to start talking about something else. So that brings us on to point 2. What is that something else? Well, what we realized also very quickly is people care more about local development than they do about almost anything else. And that local development is very local. It's not about how Ireland is developing. It's not about how the city is developing. It's about how their street is operating. It's about how their community, how functional their community is. So that was point 2. And then the third point, and I guess this is where the community wealth building comes in, it's that people have to see the benefits. They have to see the benefits of the transformation. That's what matters. And it's not about talking about warmer homes if you have to put up half the price of the retrofit in order to access it when people can't afford briquettes. That's madness. So we have to actually, speaking somewhere else, imagine if the vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic had cost 500 quid, as it looked like it might at one stage in the US. Like, we never would have gotten people vaccinated. We're doing the same, we're doing the equivalent with retrofitting in the South. We're doing the equivalent with transport. We're not talking about radically enhancing our transport system. We're talking about everyone swapping out their fossil fuel cars for lithium batteries that are mined by children in Latin America. So there's a very, very serious disconnect in terms of how we're thinking about who benefits from the action that we take on the climate crisis. And fundamentally, that's at the root of climate justice, is the equitable sharing of the benefits and the burdens of climate action. So ultimately, all of these assumptions and all of those travels around led to what was called the People's Transition. It was a report that we released last November, and that it tried to describe a participative model that would view climate action as an enabler of local development in order to stimulate local economies and bring a type of opportunity to areas that would create a virtuous cycle of demand, because that's where we need to get to. We need one community going, Jesus, how did they get that? And how do we get it? So that's where we need to go if we're to succeed. And it used as its case study agriculture in Ireland, and Sean mentioned extractive processes. Like, there's nothing more extractive than how we do agriculture currently, because on the one hand you have farmers who are like bet morning to night trying to produce what actually is a very high quality product that they're selling to large multiples, who are selling that at bargain basement prices to people who are maybe working 2 jobs on minimum wage just to get by. And they can only shop at 10 o'clock at night, so they have to go to one of these large places. And they can only afford milk if they buy it for 50 cent or 69 cent or whatever it is. And so on either side, the consumer and the producer, there's extraction taking place, and it's all flowing up to a very small number of shareholders at the top of that pile. And so how do you redress that, or how do you rebalance that equation? And really it's about taking that multiple, the supermarket multiple, and making that a cooperative of some description, so that either the consumer or the producer, or potentially both, have a share in seeing better outcomes. And you know, there was one thing that was abundantly clear from the farmers that we spoke to when we did the research, is that they all lamented a time in the South where there was, every village had a creamery, every village had a cooperative. And those were community hubs, they were places where people met and socialized, and they were also a place where they got a decent value for the product they were producing. And it's possible to go back there. In fact, I'd recommend anyone look up Clive Bright from Rare Room and Air in the west of Ireland. He's a beef farmer, very interesting guy, went to art college, went back to his family farm, and created a model of localized production that is serving him, is serving his community, and he's actually now experimenting with things like silvopasture and growing hemp and all other sorts of really exciting opportunities. So yeah, basically the People's Transition was that. It was, how do we take the assets of climate action, put them into the hands of communities, and let communities really benefit from them, so that we create a virtuous demand for change. And then AIB, quite surprisingly to myself actually, funded me to do 2 pilot projects of the People's Transition. One in Ardra and Donegal, which is this here, and one in Phibsborough in Dublin. I can't show you the Phibsborough one because we're launching the results on Sunday, and actually President Higgins is going to launch them for us, and it's pretty cool. But I can show you Ardra, because we went up to Ardra and launched these about 2 weeks ago. So just to explain how we rolled out the project, we basically broke it down into 3 phases. The pandemic really didn't help. We wanted to bring a representative sample of the community together in a room for a mini public conversation where we might, you know, distill out the needs and priorities of the community effectively. And we'd do it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks and we'd be done. It took a lot longer because of the pandemic. But essentially it was like this, and again, going back to John's point, we have to understand that our starting point is a landscape of inequality. If we don't start there, we're not going to get very far. So we began with a mapping process. That's on the far left here. I don't know, can I scroll in? Oh, I can, look at that, excellent. So we started with a mapping process. And we found out some pretty interesting things. Like, so it was just what census data is available, what has the community already done in terms of trying to map itself. Ardra is a small area, but just to really hammer home this point, people think locally, and that's why the PCAN network is so important. Place-based development, very, very important. And I think we need to really invest in facilitation of communities at the local level. So we found out that 15% of the community was living with a disability of some kind. That's a significant number, right? 18% had no access to the internet. We also had obviously the age demographics. We knew how many old and young people. I don't have the data here with me. There was 300 farmers within the area and 700 semi-skilled manual workers. There was a large amount of out-migration. That was actually changing because of the pandemic. A lot of people had come back, were working remotely, and actually had found their sense of belonging again in our DRA. We also did a survey of the kids in the community and asked them what they'd like to see, and they spoke about road safety and footpaths and greater access to green spaces and more places to play and the types of things that kids want. But I guess the most striking thing for us in the mapping was this question of, well, like, that's a lot of people struggling with disability, that's a lot of people without internet access, and that's a lot of people who are involved in manual work of some description. How do we make sure we reach them? How do we make sure we listen to them in the conversations? And so the design of the participation phase was very much informed then by those demographics. So, for example, if you've if you've 1 in 5 people don't have access to the internet, you don't just do an online survey. That's kind of what we mean here. So we spent, and I have a brilliant colleague, Susie Kahn, who some of you may have come across before. She runs Carrickdoola Permaculture Farm in Wicklow. But she also helped me here with the listening to the communities, getting to know what people actually wanted for their future. Now you'll note we're not talking about climate at all here. We've never mentioned climate to them. We're not like we park that and we just talk about, well, what do you see in our DRA in the future of your community? A lot of people hark back to, obviously there was a lot of weaving in that part of the world. There was a lot of traditional industries. There's a real romance about that, and we would be mad to ignore the stories of our communities as we plan for our future. A lot of people cared about the farmers being looked after, very conscious that farmers were under the cosh. So that was a key point. Some people spoke about rebooting local democracy. Obviously, that's a pretty interesting point to what was being said earlier. Like, it's a very big problem in the South. Like, disempowered local councils is a massive, massive issue. And one of the reasons why this isn't just a purely community wealth-building project is you couldn't, even if you wanted to find out what procurement was going on, broken down contracts, kind of access to that data, it's just not collected. So there's a big body of work just to understand how procurement is currently working. I spoke to someone in the Office of Government Procurement at the beginning about green procurement. They said, we're shipping our laptops overland. That was they were buying laptops somewhere in Europe and they were coming by land rather than by plane, and that was the green procurement piece. So I think it's improved. That was 2 years ago. I think it's improved a lot since then, but it just goes to show that there can be a long way to go. There was a lot of other things. So basically the color coding here, the orange is what we felt we could tackle. We also recognized that there was a lot more beyond that a project that we were running couldn't tackle, like recreational facilities. We weren't in the business of doing that. Community spaces, medical facilities. But this is where the community wealth building, this green circle down the bottom here, the community wealth building, our hope is that if you design the right solutions that actually bring value to the community, they can use that then for other elements of development locally, if necessary, as the guys have alluded to earlier. Sustainable quality jobs, though, was the really key thing, that there wasn't enough opportunities for people locally, and that's why there was such a large amount of out-migration. So the solutions we were able to come up with, there was 2. John mentioned the word an imperfect system. This is the archetype of an imperfect system. We shouldn't you can shoot it full of holes, and I'm perfectly happy for you to do so, but it's a start, and we did it in 6 months. That's basically, so that's my disclaimer. We had 2, a biochar cooperative and a seaweed farm run by a new seaweed company, but who had agreed a 30% profit share with the local community, a little bit like the wind farm in Fintry in Scotland. The biochar, I don't know how many of you know about biochar. It's just basically a char material, and then you can put it back in the soil, permanently removing carbon from the carbon cycle. You can put it in animal feed, and it tends to reduce methane emissions. You can you obviously, as you're charring, there's opportunities for district heating, although limited because we're not running a giant furnace, it's relatively small. But there are quite a large array of uses for the char once it's ready. And obviously in Donegal, where you have a lot of sheep's wool, you have a lot of organic material that goes to waste, like there's a lot of inputs to produce quite high quality char. There's a really exciting piece to this for anyone who's interested in hurling, and that's that, I don't know, you might know we're importing most of our hurls from China now because of ash dieback. And so the ash trees are dying out because of this disease. We can't cut them down anymore, and so most of our hurls are being imported from China. If there's studies in Scotland which show that if you inoculate the roots of ash trees with biochar as you're planting them, it prevents ash dieback. So this could actually rejuvenate ash trees in Ireland, which would be very exciting. The second prospect was a much different kettle of fish. It was a 15 square kilometre seaweed farm. So you're talking pretty large scale, as big as it gets. 100 direct jobs, maybe 100 to 150 indirect jobs. We were looking at a profit share that could, once fully operational, would bring in about 5 million to the community. There was an array of challenges with this. Firstly, that the port was in Killybegs, it wasn't in Ardra, so that was like challenge number one, who benefits? But then also uncertainty about, well, why, do we partner with a private company? Do we not try to do this ourselves? What would happen if we... So really interesting conversations it sparked. I think what it did was it gave the community an idea of just how big this can get and just how much of a role a community which is mobilized could play in the climate crisis. But I would say the biochar one is already underway. So the community are talking to the local development company, and it looks like they're going to try to get that moving. It's pretty low investment for a pretty steady climate business going forward. Seaweed, I don't see it progressing just yet, but you never know. So that was Ardra. Phibsborough, like I say, will be out on Sunday. I'm very excited about the two proposals that are coming with that. Once the cameras are off, I'll tell you what they are. And it really just, to go back to the initial point and go back to the conversation about wealth extraction and about the new economy and about inequality, and that idea that the community wealth building model, this isn't community wealth building in its typical sense, but the idea that you can put the community in charge of the future economy, or at least give them a really fair stake in it, is quite exciting. And it's something I think that unless we do, we're going to fail with the transition anyway, so we may as well get on with it. So it's a model. The report can just be picked up. I think it can be applied pretty easily. You don't need task to do it. You don't need, but what you do need, I think, at some point is the collaboration between the universities or the experts. We consulted a biochar expert, we consulted numerous seaweed experts to bring that co-creation where you're bringing the local knowledge and the expert knowledge together to formulate solutions that are genuinely community owned. So that's it. I don't have a good closer, so we'll just leave it at that. Thanks, folks.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Sean. Okay, you've been very patient, folks, sitting there being talked at for well over an hour. So it's over to you now in terms of any questions, and try and make them questions as opposed to statements. So, yes, gentleman at the back. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to repeat back people's questions for the purposes of the recording. So, is the £100 spend local scheme a good example of community wealth building? I'll put this to Mary and then see to Sean. You can be excused, Sean, because this is a northern issue. See, I use pounds, you see, the Queen's shilling as opposed to yours.
It doesn't have to be spent locally. We've been asked to spend it locally, but there's nothing to stop people going online and that money all just going straight out of here. I also think that it's money that, while some people really, really need it at the moment, others don't. And I also think it won't have any legacy, and it could have been invested in something else that would have had a legacy, such as there is a campaign for a mutual bank here, and something, the money that's being used could have been used to support something like that that would actually have a lasting legacy in the region.
Sean?
Yeah, I suppose there is that argument that the money could be put to better use. To put into services or to plug the gap in universal credit or whatever it may be. There are those arguments emerging, and there's the fact that it doesn't have to be spent in your local SME. But I don't want to be a austerity hawk. I'd be very reluctant to tell people who have spent the last 2 years, and in fact the last 40 years, suffering and having things cut from them, that this is a bad thing, or trying to tell them where they should or shouldn't spend their money. So I'll probably leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. It does give me an idea for a future event on functional finance and modern monetary theory. It shows you that the issue is that not that there's no money, it is how we choose to create the money. Modern states like Britain do not have to raise taxes to spend. They simply create the money through spending. I'll leave you with that head melter, and we can come back and have a session about that at another time. Any other questions? We just want to give as many people a chance, and particularly any women. Sorry, Aidan. Yes.
What can we as individuals do then within our own communities to try and foster this spirit moving forward?
Okay. So what can we do as communities to push forward this agenda around community wealth building and so on? Perhaps I'll start with you, Sean.
I think what we found very interesting about our draft project was it was only about 4 people in the community really drove it forward. Obviously they had the support from us. We were trying to give them money to do it. They wouldn't take it. They were brilliant. They hadn't done this sort of stuff before. It was brand new to them. And literally they just organised their community. They went out talking to people. They got people involved. They encouraged people to think about it in a different way. So I think you can do loads. But I think we have to move away from the individual, we as individuals, and move into what can me and my mates do if we were to get together and try to do this as a group. The less we're on our own with it, the better.
Mm-hmm. I don't know whether Sean or Mary want to.
What we've found, we've been spending some time recently engaging with communities and community organisations around community wealth building, and you find that a lot of them are already doing some of this stuff, themselves. They've been doing it for 30, 40 years, identifying land, identifying assets that can be put to use with community benefits, finding ways of sourcing finance, finding ways of creating employment in their own communities. They're already doing it, but what's missing, I suppose, is the enabling framework, policy and legislative framework to support them in those efforts. So a lot of it is already happening, and we've taken a fair bit of flack for daring to come in and preach to people about what they should or shouldn't be doing, and rightly so.
Mary?
Yeah, that's, as Sean says, that there is quite a bit of this happening, and it's not like to try and give a message tonight that it's happening elsewhere and some of this isn't happening here. There are community energy companies here. There are cooperatives, for example. I think people can find out more about those. They can also, I think there's maybe a lack of awareness about the model, maybe, and what it can be achieved. And there's a sort of, I found for myself when working in community that I thought the issue was poverty, but as John was saying earlier, on what I've seen with community wealth building is that actually the issue is it's wealth. Mm-hmm. And I think for people to really begin to see that, do you know that there is massive amounts of money? I mean, in 2018, I heard the former Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies saying that due to the size of our public sector, we shouldn't have poverty in Northern Ireland. And that was the first time I'd actually heard our public sector referred to as being something that could be positive. And actually, with the Northern Ireland the Northern Ireland Spend Local scheme, and Sean is right that there's an awful lot of people out there that need that money, but it's supposed to stimulate our economy. But when it says that, you sort of have this narrative that the only thing in our economy is the shops and the hospitality and the services, but actually our public sector is a really huge part of our economy, as is the voluntary sector here, which employs 7%, voluntary and community sector, which employs 7% of people. So yeah, I think that we need a greater awareness about what our economy is.
Mm-hmm. Before I let my next speaker in, I just want to draw your attention. This is Queen's corporate strategy, and draw your attention to the bit at the bottom. The university here is committing itself in part to be a community anchor. Yourself, did you want to? Yeah.
Is it part of the community wealth building strategy to convince businesses that have really big growth goals to try and focus more on their local economy and limit like what they want to do, like their aspirations in a sense?
Okay. So is it part of the community wealth building strategy to incentivize local businesses who may be growth orientated and maybe looking outside the economy to look within and to relocalize themselves? So now, Sean, do you want to take that?
You start.
I think, I mean, from as we understand it, and it's the principal objective is to encourage public anchors in the first instance to change how they approach economic development, to change how they allocate their procurement spend, and through that to change how the local economy, the local commercial sector, including the local commercial sector, is structured. And if that has knock-on effects in terms of localising the activities of some of the businesses in the area, then that's a good thing. But the primary objective is to shift the practices of the public anchors.
Just a thought, I think like a lot of small SMEs are already wealth builders in a sense, like a little bit like the guys were saying, but like a lot of this stuff's already going on. To give you an example of a friend of mine who set up a cafe in Dublin, and he was employing 6 people, buying from local producers and paying more in tax than Starbucks. And so this is where the imbalance is, and I think our focus, and this is a very serious thing in terms of COP right now, where there's an awful lot of talk about using public money to create an enabling environment for the mobilization of private capital. And that to me is insane, because we should be taking the private capital through taxation and using it through community wealth building to actually change the game. Whereas what we're talking about is enabling, using public funding to enable further extraction.
Or what I call biofueling the Hummer. That's the game plan. So, Aidan, do you want to come in now?
Yeah.
You can take off your mask.
I guess it's kind of like in a principle that's, on top of any of the students here, in terms of taking action regarding the fact that Queens is an anchored institution, looking at how we can start influencing Queens to, procure, and also how that would work with Queens being involved in the decision-making process over like what areas would it procure? Would it be like local? Would it be like in the woodlands, or could we also look towards like obviously areas that could be most immediately affected would be like North Belfast seawalls and stuff like that. And also like how as an environmental officer with the student union, and motivate the student union to do anything regarding that, and create some kind of movement in that way. And I suppose so similar to like the last couple of questions,
I'll take this one as a Queen's member of staff. I think, Aidan, the issues you raised in terms of Queen has committed to being an anchor institution. What are the issues around how it procures? And we're an enormous organisation that consumes a lot of energy, materials, goods, food, and so on. And I think it is a genuine issue. And I'm going to suggest you come to my event tomorrow night. Because tomorrow night we have an event on universities' responsibilities in the context of the planetary crisis. And I think that would be an ideal discussion, because that would be full of only Queen's staff, including some senior management people. And I think that's something that we should ask and explore, and not in any negative way, but genuinely, how can the work that Mary did for her master's dissertation was a real eye-opener for me, that the enormous power of the public sector institutions of this city Belfast Health and Social Care Trust is the biggest trust in the UK. An enormous employer, an enormous purchasing power. Belfast Harbour Estate, TransLink, Belfast City Council, Queens University, Belfast Met, University of Ulster. Imagine them coming together and signing a concordat or a memorandum of trying to use that massive, even procurement power to try and break up contracts at local companies, because often local companies are too small. And the structure of our economy in Northern Ireland is that it's mostly SME, family-owned small businesses who cannot compete for these big contracts. Not only is there power in a union, because I seen Billy Bragg last night and that's what he sang, there's also power in the public sector institutions. Lying wasted, it's like a muscle that's atrophying in terms of not being used for public purpose. So anyway, you don't need to come now tomorrow night, that's my answer. So, yes.
It's more a comment. I was involved in Local Agenda 21, and you're all too young probably.
I remember it.
Yeah, so it was the precursor of all of the conversations that we're having tonight, and a lot of the stuff that's sustained my work with Neil McEnroy and Claes 20 years ago, and we were having these conversations. Now I'm working in public policy and health. We haven't even identified, in England, I work with my colleagues in England, all the NH trusts are really embracing the anchor institution, not even on our agenda. It's the shift to bring this conversation that always appears to be marginal into the mainstream, and how do we shift the your biofueling, the Hummer, that we have those two things going on, that we want to embrace this agenda, meanwhile we're still on the old agenda, and there's not enough demand or not enough push or not enough challenge to the old way of doing things that really begin to tip how the public sector move. And when they do, they probably will. But my gosh, it's a long journey. But we do. But I think it's coming. But it's just the sheer frustration. I mean, I love the creative ways that you've been talking about how to repurpose the conversation. Because if you're looking, if you provide other ways of thinking about it, you can get there. But that to me is just the sheer. How do you actually make this mainstream?
So I'm not going to attempt to summarise that for the purpose of the camera, but it's largely around how long things take in terms of shifting what's sometimes called the Overton Window. Have you ever heard of the Overton Window? This is this imagined space that change is only possible in policy terms in this really, really narrow space. And I think it's time to smash the Overton Window, because it's taken too long, the planet is burning, the time is running out. But I would like to invite Mary, because I think her research that she did, and I correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, Belfast should have been Preston.
Yes.
They came here and they seen the wealth in terms of the public sector and even the high levels. I know it's sectarianized, the high levels of social capital and community and so on. And yet, for whatever reason, and that's the issue that Mary looked at in terms of why didn't Belfast grasp what Preston did in terms of we are a much better placed in terms of picking the public sector. So, Mary.
Well, it's not even like, I mean, Belfast seemed to have been into this themselves in 2012. And you can go into, do you remember this? I'd love to chat to you about it, because I couldn't really find anyone who was about it at the time. But in 2012, Belfast commissioned research by Claes. Yeah, is that what you said? I'm really hard of hearing, so I couldn't hear you properly. But Belfast commissioned research by Claes back in 2012. And if you go back into the minutes and look, it was like, the document that they presented to council was really forward thinking, saying, oh, there's this research coming out of America, and it wasn't even Cleveland at that point, but there was research coming out of America, and it was saying that anchor institutions had replaced the big manufacturing institutions as the drivers of the local economy. And they wanted this research done. So Claes completed this research in 2013, and it's called The Impact of the Belfast Anchor Institutions. And I mean, it is just fascinating, because they identified, at that time there was like, 2 billion in spend between them, which had a bigger economic impact. I can't remember the exact figure. It employed a massive amount of people in Belfast. As John says, the Belfast Trust, over 20,000 employees. and they owned 40% of the land in Belfast. And they were supposed to take, to collaborate together and take the procurement piece forward through the community planning process, and then nothing happened. Nothing happened. Everybody continued to work in their silos in the community planning. Belfast City Council remained wedded to an approach that valued foreign direct investment over what they already had. I mean, Matthew Brown in Preston talks about how they were blessed. But at that time, Belfast was twice as blessed as Preston, because they had twice the spend that Preston had. So anyway, Claes moved from Belfast. We're working with Belfast, but they moved to Preston because Preston were willing to take it forward and Belfast weren't. But just to say, there is, as John said, there's massive amount of money in Belfast. And I was so annoyed when I learned about this in 2018 because of the poverty that I was seeing in the advice centre that I was working in. Do you know? And to think it doesn't have to be that way.
Belfast City Council committees where progressive dreams go to die.
Yeah.
So we have time for a couple of more questions. Yes, right at the back there. Speak up, enunciate to the front. Yeah, speak.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I got a read over the time. So you were saying about like a lack of awareness for community wealth building and the initiatives that are currently happening within communities and co-ops and etc. So, but I was just wondering, like, are there any collective resources about who's doing what and like how groups and individuals who are currently disconnected from these ideas can get involved with either spreading these ideas or directly affecting change within their communities, and if not, are there any resources available, as Sean has said, for you and your mates to create these kind of community work building initiatives within their communities, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So just basically, like, are there kind of like a centralized resource of who is doing what community groups are doing X, Y, Z, and like how people can actually tackle this themselves?
Excellent question. I was going to repeat it back. Is that the question is, are there any resources or central coordinating hub where people can find out more and see what's going on in different places? So I don't know about Sean.
As far as I know, there's been no formal exercise to sort of map what's been happening here. It's only in your encounters through the various community networks and so on that you find out what's happening, and through your engagement with communities that you discover the extent of what's been happening in those communities. It's probably a worthwhile exercise to undertake, but in terms of general resources around community wealth building and the different places where it's been tried and what form it's taken in those places, CLES is the go-to. The Centre for Local Economic Strategies is the go-to place, really. They produce umpteen reports on different community wealth building agendas in different localities across Britain and the north here. They're also in the process of developing a toolkit, all right, Steve? Developing a toolkit so that community wealth building principles and practices can be taken, adapted and implemented in different contexts. So they're the go-to organisation really in this part of the world.
Was that again
CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies.
Sean, do you?
I think also just as well as CLES Democracy Collaborative in the US have some really interesting initiatives, and one in particular, the Mountain Association in Kentucky, just are a really interesting example of how retrofitting can spiral into something huge if you get it done right at the small scale. They started retrofitting SMEs, and now there's about 7 different retrofitting companies. But I think just in terms of like who can do what is a good question, because like unless you're a council or you've got some leverage over the public spend, it's hard to we're waiting for the politics to swing in favour of the community. But on Sunday we're having this event with the president to launch the Fibsborough results of that study, and we wanted it to be a platform for everyone in the community who's doing anything in this regard. And we started putting out feelers. We ended up with we've about 20 different organisations who are doing something in relation to environment within maybe a 3 square mile area. So what I'd say as well is there's a space, I think, everywhere for all of these things are mushrooming. These different communities trying to do stuff, but there's a space to connect them, to like start bringing them all together, because otherwise they're all going to get disenchanted or be in silos or whatever. Whereas actually if you had 20 different organizations in a small part of a city all clamoring for community wealth building, that puts a different spin on the next election.
Mm-hmm. I'd also suggest, for not just for yourself who asked the question, but anybody else, that this is what the university should be doing. We should be hosting these discussions, bringing in people so that people can get inspired, empowered. I mean, you know, hopefully you've gone away with some other new ideas. You don't have to agree with it, but we see this as it should be the public service of the university to be able to provide spaces for these type of discussions. And certainly you could invite any of our speakers, I'm sure. They do bar mitzvahs, weddings, but also really good in terms of community settings as well. I'm really curious, on the right-hand side here, we haven't had any questions. So does anyone like to have a go at a question without a beard? It rules out half of this side.
Damien was thinking about it.
Every man has a beard, has it?
Okay, go on.
You're being radical by being clean shaven, Sean.
Yeah, I know.
Community wealth, given what's been said by the speakers so far, can community wealth building and donut economics exist and thrive within capitalism in the absence of education, agitation, and protest?
So can community wealth building and donut economics exist within capitalism? Well, I know donuts exist within my ever-increasing waistline, but it's that issue. Can these models exist, coexist, expand within capitalism? So looking at Mary, big question.
That's a really, really big question. I mean, I think both of them are trying to change capitalism. Both of them are looking for a paradigm shift to move beyond economic growth. I don't know if I'm best qualified to answer this question, but that would be my take on it. No, it's about changing the ownership, and it's about, well, community wealth building is definitely about changing ownership, and therefore I would say no. If it's done across all of those 5 pillars, and it's setting out to do what I think places like Preston are trying to do, for example, or North Ayrshire, then no, I don't. And I suppose community wealth building isn't like a theory that's written down. You know, it's something. It's a set of practices, and it's evolving. And I think from talking to the people and looking at their plans there, like say in Preston, for example, they did their procurement and their, you know, fair employment and all of that. But now they're moving on to developing their cooperatives to change the ownership, and they want the bank that's owned by the people as well. Do you know? So I think no, I would say.
Non-beardy Sean?
Yeah, I suppose it's look, community wealth building, it's not, as John has said, it's not a panacea. You know, like even you're able to create an island of socialism in one municipality, you're still going to come under the sustained pressure. You're still going to come into conflict with capital, with vested interests, with power, and you're going to come under the pressures of being surrounded by a sea of capitalism, as Steve has described it. So, like, it's not a panacea, but it's one route towards starting to democratize capital, democratize ownership. Putting wealth and value back in the hands of those who produce it. So like it's one means to an end in my view, like, but you know, those pressures are always going to be there without that sort of agitation and political education and the paradigm shift that we all want to see.
Sean?
I don't think it exists within neoliberalism, but it's an effort to counteract that. To me, I'm going to say something now, I don't know if it's true, but I think it is. I think Labour performed better in the local elections just gone by everywhere they were implementing local wealth building than anywhere else. So I think in terms of long-term sustainability of our democracies through the climate crisis, it's a leg of it. But like you're saying about agitation and protest, like look at COP, look at how you've no observers having access to negotiations and you've Shell all over the place. Like, it's a catastrophe. And that won't change, that power dynamic won't change without something more than we're currently seeing, I think. We're not going to bargain them out of their positions of power, I don't think.
That's great. Well, I think, folks, that now concludes our meeting. I want to thank all our speakers. Thank you all for coming along tonight. As I say, there's lots of events happening in relation to COP, the climate, the planetary crisis, all across the university in the next 10 days. Hopefully see you at some of them. So stay safe, wash your hands, and socially distance from neoliberalism.